Hey there, welcome to the Lore to Death podcast, a deep dive into the lore of your favorite games, movies, shows, and more. My name is Brett, and today I am still baffled by how much everyone is loving the Baldur's Gate 3 and Dungeons & Dragons content. Every time I make a new episode in this universe, I get twice as many responses asking for more episodes on the matter, and don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining at all. I love this universe, and I will write about it as long as you guys are willing to listen to it. And so today we have, and I'm sorry if I'm totally butchering the pronunciation of your username, Hidolfar, who used the Spotify Q&A function to give a suggestion for this week's episode. And they said, love the D&D/BG lore content, do some more, love to hear the various races. And first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for the feedback. I'm glad you're enjoying my ranting and raving, and I'm forever grateful for everyone who tunes in. Secondly, I feel like this is a good time for a call to action by reminding everyone that I am always open to suggestions for topics, because it means that A, I know that you're enjoying what I'm doing and you want to hear something, and B, it helps me out because some weeks I have no idea what to write about. And it's really helpful to have a little stream of consciousness out there just feeding me ideas. Lazy? Maybe. Makes me more productive? Definitely. I'm most active on Instagram at Lore to Death, or you can send an email to loretodeath@gmail.com, or just like Hidofar, use the Spotify Q&A function if you're listening on Spotify. So this episode goes out to you, Hidofar, near, far, wherever you are. I thought it would be interesting to stay within the realm of Baldur's Gate 3 and cover something that you hear about in the game, but never get a really great explanation for. Because the only two people who are willing to talk about the Illithid Empire are Lae'zel, who doesn't want to talk about Illithids just on principle, and the Emperor, who is one who veils everything that he says so as not to be a lie, but not tell the entire truth. And so that's the topic for today, is the Illithid Empire. But not just the Illithid Empire, I kind of wanted to go over Illithids in general as a race before I get to the Empire. So I want to cover the who, what, where, when, and why the Illithids are what they are, and why they're such a detestable race in the D&D universe. But before I get to that, I wanted to preface that I really only intended on writing about the Illithid Empire and not Illithids in general. But I thought it would be a good little introduction to kind of understand what the Illithid race is, so that we can better understand their goals for creating the Empire. And I didn't realize just what I was getting into. As of writing this preamble, I have just under 8,000 words, which is about 12 full pages of just content about who Illithids are before even getting to the Empire. I did not think that they were that fleshed out, and I did not think that it would be this difficult to research because, oh boy, there are a lot of sources out there. And when you have a lot of sources, that usually means a lot of conflicting ideas. Leave it up to Wizards of the Coast to write about a race for 30 years and create so much confusing overlap that I have to actually think while I'm writing. Anyways, I just thought that was hilarious because this could have been a very short and sweet episode, but apparently I can't let myself just get ahead of the curve with short episodes. So with that entirely out of the way, our first and arguably the most important question is, who and what are Illithids? Illithids are known as Mind Flayers to most, and Geich to the Githyanki race. I'm going to just kind of interchange Illithid and Mind Flayer because they both mean the same thing, and it just kind of sounds better one way or the other. Plus, if I have two words to refer to a race as, then that means that I don't have to say Illithid like 300 times today. So it helps you, it helps me, it helps everyone. In every iteration of D&D, they are aligned as lawful evil, which says a lot about their character. Mind Flayers are sadistic aberrations who are feared by most across the universe due to their powerful psionic abilities. Also known as a mind ruler, their main form of attack is to exert control over their victims by controlling their minds, specifically so that they can use other life forms as thralls before extracting their personality by consuming their brains while the victim is still alive. In terms of physical appearance, their most distinguishable feature is the massive tentacles on their face that surround their mouth and their oblong octopus-like heads. In physical size, weight, and general build, they're roughly comparable to the average human, but the way that their bodies look is described as a gruesome mockery of the humanoid form, with soft, rubbery skin, again, much like an octopus, that was anywhere from green to purple in color. Also different than the average human, Mind Flayers were on a strict diet of brains only. Also different from the average human, Mind Flayers are on a strict diet of brains only, have a mucous membrane on their skin that smells like onions, garlic, and vanilla, apparently, and have silvery white blood. The tentacles on their face are actually very dexterous. Again, much like an octopus. I'm going to keep going back to octopi for a while, but the tentacles on their face were able to be moved individually with great precision. These tentacles range anywhere from 2 to 4 feet long, depending on the size and maturity of the Illithid. Under their tentacles was a mouth, unlike an octopus, but more like a lamprey or a leech, which is circular, jawless, and ringed by several rows of small, sharp teeth. It's a good thing that they have tentacles, because their mouths are an absolute nightmare, and despite the tentacles being mildly terrifying, it is a great improvement over the alternative. And while it doesn't appear that Illithids have jaws, they can actually physically speak deep speech, undercommon, and common, and can understand many languages because of their high intelligence. But they choose not to because they prefer telepathic communication instead. It's one part intimidation and one part just being evil. I feel like never actually speaking out loud kind of goes in line with their evil character, because if you can telepathically communicate with your buddy that you're going to eat someone's brains without that person hearing you, then all the better, because then they don't know that you're going to eat their brains, but you're gonna eat their brains. So, I mean, you might as well do it. And on the topic of their speech, Mind Flayers have a written language called Qualith, which is actually really neat. Despite it not looking particularly intricate, in reality, it's probably more complex than most other languages. Qualith consists of a pattern of 4 lines to communicate letters, words, etc. But each one of these characters are imbued with psionic energy, which not only convey what is written, but is capable of conveying the author's thoughts and feelings at the time of writing. I think that's really cool, personally. Illithids don't have the problems that we face when sending letters or texts because their emotions are straight up imbued into their words. If I had that power, I wouldn't have to constantly supplement every text with emojis so that people don't think I'm just upset with them, because texting is a nightmare. Why can't we just adopt Qualith? I think it's a much better system. Anyways, Illithid names were also written in Qualith, which brings a myriad of interesting issues. Because the language is so dependent on conveying the author's thoughts and intentions behind the words, names are very much the same way. While their name might be something quite simple when written, their names all carried a great weight and could not be properly expressed through regular words. So basically, an Illithid's name is their entire life story and journey in a single word. Because their names are so complex, Mind Flayers would often adopt another simpler name that their thralls would know them as. It was usually something extremely edgy to instill fear, but with an emphasis on being pronounceable in any tongue. And that's important when you get talking about the Illithid Empire. Other races of the Underdark had rough translations for Illithid's true names, but they were basically just a form of being able to identify other Mind Flayers, and didn't really convey their actual names, meaning, or anything. It was just something that they themselves could understand. Getting back to their physical form, an Illithid's hands were similar to humans, once again, but they had long, slender fingers and a distinct lack of an index finger. Their hands are clawed with great long nails that look rather intimidating, but are actually the opposite. Their nails, while appearing almost like talons, consisted of a soft cartilage and therefore were rather ineffective when used as a weapon. They have 2 toes, which are webbed, which make them seem more like an aquatic race than they appear otherwise, which, again, octopus, I don't know. But their eyes are actually very not octopus-like, which I feel like is the only thing that I would change about their appearance personally, but I will admit that their eyes make them somehow more intimidating, and they don't just look like an octopus with legs. Their eyes are typically pale and devoid of pupils, which makes them just feel evil and lifeless and creepy. Illithids also lack protruding ears, but rather have small holes in the side of their head instead. Nor did they have nostrils, which is probably why they're content smelling like garlic and onions all the time. And I'm not sure if they can actually smell or not, but I would assume that they operate much like an octopus. And I know, again, with the octopus crap, but octopi smell and taste with the little suckers on their tentacles, so maybe Illithids do the same. I have no idea. And now that I've written 600 words on how they look, I think it's about time that we get into their personality, abilities, and so on and so forth. And this is where we get into the real meat and potatoes of the episode. There is a lot here. And it was really hard to organize my thoughts while I was writing this, because every time I'd write one section, I'm like, ooh, but this belongs in this section. I would go back and forth and back and forth. So this might just sound like a full-on ADHD rant, and I apologize so much. But I tried to organize it as best as I could. So Illithids were built a little differently when it came to their personalities. Because if I'm being honest, they actually really don't have personalities. Instead, they have a crippling superiority and god complex, and were never not thinking about ways to dominate other races so they could have full control over the multiverse. Which is exactly what the Illithid Empire is all about, but we're getting ahead of ourselves there. While some Illithids could show extreme variance in how they wanted to execute their plans, they are malevolent and sinister by nature and basically all share a common set of beliefs, hence the lawful evil alignment. I love this little excerpt from the book Lords of Madness, the Book of Aberrations, because it's so brutally honest about Mind Flayers and how they interact with the world. Mind Flayers have no friends. If an Illithid treats a creature of another race as an equal, it is pretending friendship. Other races are useful when they bring information and trade goods. Ultimately, Illithids have only two ways of interacting with other races: enslavement and consumption. If an Illithid treats a drow or dragar respectfully, never differentially, it is only doing so to serve its own purpose. Mind Flayer society is unique in that Illithids know their destiny is to dominate the universe. Illithids are not so foolish to believe that the future cannot be changed, however, so they are not complacent. And honestly, these two paragraphs are enough to describe the belief system of the Illithids almost entirely. They are egomaniacal creatures who have a destiny to rule the universe and yearn for nothing else. In their mind, they are acting as a force of order, tasked with taming a chaotic and unguided universe. So, in their minds, they're almost the caretakers of the universe, and the other races are merely children who don't know any better, who are acting on pure impulse rather than thought or ambition. And the Illithids are there to make sure that basically no one spills a drink on the carpet. It's actually much the same as how we view something like a feral animal, like a raccoon. If we leave the raccoon to its own devices, it's going to knock over the garbage bin and get garbage all over our yard while it's looking for food. And so we have to be there to make sure that we put measures in place that this doesn't happen. And of course, if you approach a wild raccoon, it's probably going to try to fight you. It's only natural because you are clearly a predator and clearly superior to this little raccoon. So if it fights back against control, it's because it's scared and it doesn't know any better. And this is exactly how Illithids view other races, as inferior creatures who need to be tamed by force, made to work for them, and then eaten as livestock. And it was this dominion over others that enthralled them so much that it was a first right of sorts to adulthood among Illithids to dominate a thrall. And according to the Illithiad, a Mind Flayer cannot truly call itself an Illithid until it does so. And just in case I haven't made it clear enough yet, when a Mind Flayer takes a thrall, it is taking over the mind of another being and basically erasing all of their personality, wants, and interests and making them a slave through mind control. So this thrall will do literally anything for the Mind Flayer, and it has no choice. And also, according to the source that I was talking about before, Illithids have a very intimate relationship with their thralls, despite it being such a one-sided relationship. It doesn't happen very often, but if a thrall were to die of natural causes, say disease, age, or conflict, the Illithid would suffer in turn. If this happened, it would often cause the Illithid to put a full stop on whatever their goal was at the time to replenish their supply of thralls as quickly as possible. It's almost like they couldn't live without them. And it's said that some Illithids would go mad if they didn't have thralls surrounding them at all times. I find this fascinating, honestly, and it really shows, despite being creatures of a single thought, seemingly showing no emotions, that Illithids were capable of a range of emotions, in fact, and were very social creatures. Illithids felt anger when they're being cheated out of their goals, happiness when a plan came together, and sorrow when they lost something that they held dear, like a thrall. But having emotions didn't mean that a Mind Flayer would live, like you or I, trying their best to make sure that they were happy and what they were doing was for their own well-being. But everything they did for the sake of domination, which had nothing to do with how content they were in their life. The closest that it's described that a Mind Flayer can be to being happy is when consuming a particularly scrumptious brain. But I'm not sure if I can call that pure happiness, as there was a certain sadism to it. So instead of aiming for happiness in their lives, I think it's better to say that Illithids aimed for self-satisfaction through gaining knowledge and seeing a plan come together. And that being said, for some reason it seems that Mind Flayers tend to enjoy living lavishly. And maybe it's because of their inherent superiority complex, but they're often caught seeking to live in luxury rather than hide in the shadows and squalor. Which is funny considering that most of them come from underground caverns in the Underdark. In being able to feel complex emotions, while Mind Flayers have a singular goal in mind, their way of getting to that goal differs from one another, like I kind of mentioned before. Mind Flayers are inherently intelligent creatures, also mentioned before, which meant that they were natural masterminds. Each plan that they made was very well thought out and executed to minutia. But one Illithid might think it's best to take a slow approach and create a thrall army to take over a plane over the course of a decade or so, while others might think it's best to seek out magical artifacts that they can use to enhance their psionic abilities and take a more direct genocidal approach. And because their plans are too intricate and complex, it's hard for other races to truly comprehend what they're trying to accomplish, which made them somewhat of an enigma, and made all of their attacks seem like they came out of nowhere. Further on the concept of individuality amongst Mind Flayers is that sometimes they would step on each other's webbed toes, and conflict amongst their own kind was not uncommon. They all came from the same place and they all have the same goals, but they're extremely competitive. This made it hard for Mind Flayers to work as a team, and forced them to often operate as a single unit. But despite this animosity towards their own kind, they also had the understanding that what they were trying to accomplish was for the greater good of all Mind Flayers. And so the group of Mind Flayers must be taken into consideration in every single action. For it was their race that was supposed to succeed, not the individual. So while they were all very individualistic and competitive, a Mind Flayer society was built on the idea that there were no drifters and no charity for Illithids that did not wish to contribute to the greater good. Any Illithid that did not comply with their strictly structured society did not hold on to their life for very long. If there was something that the colony needed, like a big secret or something that they needed some serious manpower for, they would occasionally form what was called an Inquisition. This was something like an adventuring party, consisting of a few Mind Flayers that would be grouped together to complete an objective. If this was not enough, then they would form what they called a cult, which was basically the same thing but in a larger format. So instead of like 4 Mind Flayers that would form an Inquisition, it would be like 8 or 10 Mind Flayers that would form a cult. That sort of thing. In the instance of a cult, many Mind Flayers would get together and would be led by 2 Mind Flayers who would be in charge of strategizing and executing the objective. This did not happen often, but it was mostly put together if there was something highly profitable that was outside of the Elder Brain's control. And because it was out of the Brain's control, and we'll get back to Elder Brains in a little bit, there's a whole section on Elder Brains. But because it was out of the Brain's control, it was more dangerous for the Mind Flayers to be operating in a group. Hence, why it was not done very often. But when an Inquisition or cult was formed, it was because there was a key element that would lead to dominion or accumulation of great knowledge. And they pretty much had to put a Mind Flayer in control of the group, otherwise they would all bicker and squabble. But if their bosses, the Elder Brain, said, hey, Jerry's in charge of this one, everyone kind of had to listen. They didn't really have a choice. And again, we'll get back to that in a minute. I just mentioned great knowledge and accumulations of knowledge, and that's because it was a Mind Flayer's goal to accumulate as much knowledge as possible. For to them, knowledge equaled power, and they really based their self-worth and their group worth on shared information. Since Illithids are not physically strong creatures, having no natural defenses like sharp claws or large frames, they had to seek another avenue in order to succeed. This meant exploring all avenues of magic, technology, alchemy, among other academia in order to make up for their weak physical forms. To this point, they would bargain with other beings for information, or sometimes take a more direct approach and interrogate and kill them for it. They spied, stole, and plundered information from crypts so that they could uncover information not known by everyone, in an effort to gain the upper hand on them by finding something like forgotten technology that was buried for being too dangerous, or magic spells that were discarded for being too destructive. But they could not bide their time forever. While Mind Flayers have a longer lifespan than that of a typical human, a Mind Flayer would live around 125 years or so. Around 10 of those years were spent as a tadpole in the Elder Pool. So they had realistically about 100 years to enact a plan to dominate planes. And I don't know about you, but to dominate an entire plane of existence, 100 years does not sound like a lot of time to do it. So it's a pretty lofty goal for such a short span of time. But Mind Flayers did not think of time as finite. In fact, they're one of the only races that don't consider time much at all, but rather view the present as their reality. This is because to them, the future was set in stone, as they believe that their future is to dominate the universe. So they already know what's to come, so they only really have to focus on what was right in front of them. However, and I kind of mentioned this before, I feel like it's important to note that just because they believe that the future is inevitable does not mean that they were complacent in believing that no matter what they did, they would take control of the universe. Every waking minute of every single day, a Mind Flayer would dedicate themselves to gaining more power, gaining more knowledge, gaining more anything, so that they could make sure that the future was inevitable. And I feel like it's worth bringing up that the past was something that did not concern them, for the past was just history, and history was something that the Elder Brain was responsible for, being a living record of their colony's collective memory, which made them kind of indifferent to the past as well. They could learn from it, but they didn't dwell on it. And now I've brought up the Elder Brain enough times that I feel like I need to actually talk about the Elder Brain. So you could consider the Elder Brain as their god, although they did not worship it as other races might worship their own deities. The Elder Brain was seen as the final stage in a Mind Flayer's life cycle, in which all Mind Flayers would become part of once they died. Mind Flayers did not have a fear of death or an afterlife to look forward to per se, but rather looked forward to becoming one with the collective consciousness that was the Elder Brain once again. Mind Flayer clutches, which every Mind Flayer lays once or twice in their lifetime, are typically deposited in a briny pool in which the Elder Brain resides. And once the eggs hatch, they start as tadpoles, swimming around in the brain brine. During this time, the 10 years or so that they spent as a tadpole, they spent growing and consuming brain matter until they're about 3 inches in length and look like a miniature squid or octopus. However, despite laying clutches of eggs, only about every 1 in 1,000 tadpoles end up reaching maturity. And this is because the Elder Brain consumes the rest to sustain itself, along with the brain matter that the Mind Flayers present it with. But what happens if they are not consumed by the Elder Brain? Well, there's an interesting phenomenon that happened if tadpoles were left unchecked, such as in an event where the Mind Flayer colony was abandoned or the Elder Brain was killed and there's nothing to eat the excess tadpoles. The tadpoles will eventually begin to prey on each other, consuming their other kin in the briny pool. Eventually, only the strongest survived and evolved into what I can only describe as a psychic worm, which I guess is just really a larger form of the tadpole. These are called illithocytes, and tend to gather themselves around areas with very strong psychic radiation, which they would feed on. Alternatively, instead of turning into an illithocyte, they could turn into a neothelid, which is a much larger creature with a gaping mouth and tentacles. And instead of feeding on psychic radiation, these creatures would hunt down living creatures so they could eat their brains, much like a Mind Flayer, albeit more destructive and less cunning due to their low intelligence. Both of these creatures, the illithocytes and the neothelids, were loathed by Mind Flayers. They were aberrations and they saw them as not their own kind, and so they were hunted down relentlessly. This is because they caused unorganized chaos. And while they could destroy entire colonies by themselves, it wasn't calculated. It wasn't Mind Flayer. It wasn't what they wanted to do. They were left unchecked, they were seen as aberrations, and so they were killed on sight. However, when they were not left unchecked, once a tadpole reaches maturity, they were subject to seromorphosis, which is the process in which a tadpole gains a body and becomes what we would know as a Mind Flayer. If you've played Baldur's Gate 3, then you should be pretty familiar with this process. A tadpole would be inserted into a humanoid creature through the eye, where it would very quickly burrow into the brain and begin consuming it. In D&D terms, the process in which it took to devour the brain of the host is about 3 rounds, or 18 seconds. Which sounds insane, because how does a 3-inch octopus eat the entire brain in 18 seconds? Well, they don't. The tadpole will gravitate towards the lower brainstem and consume that to kill their host. Once the host is dead, their body will be turned into a Mind Flayer over the course of a few days. Over the course of a few days, seromorphosis replaces all of the body tissue with that of an illithid until it is no longer recognizable as the original host, including all internal and external organs. And I feel like it's worth mentioning external organs because all Mind Flayers are inherently sexless, neither male nor female. And that's why I mentioned before that every single Mind Flayer will lay a clutch of eggs in their lifetime. And while it's never directly said, it seems that they can asexually reproduce this way. But once a tadpole is burrowed into the host and has a hold of the brainstem, This process is irreversible. Not cure disease, restoration, or resurrection can bring a person back. The only course after that point, if you don't want a Mind Flayer coming up, is to destroy the tadpole and stop it from becoming a Mind Flayer entirely. And the best way to do this is to take the American History X approach, minus the racism, and just curb stomp like crazy. Typically, for all intents and purposes, the person who turned into a Mind Flayer is both gone in body and mind. However, there is a phenomenon, albeit a rare one, where the Mind Flayer mind can suffer from what is known as partialism, which is known as the incomplete sublimation of the host's mind. This would cause partial personality traits from the original host being to come to the surface every once in a while. Usually this happens when the Mind Flayer is preoccupied with something or in a daze, daydreaming, deep in thought, something of that sort. And partialism would manifest itself in minor autonomous actions that you or I probably wouldn't notice that we do, like tapping your fingers or feet rhythmically or humming a song that they knew in their previous life. Allegedly, it's been known to happen that when writing in particular, a Mind Flayer would start writing in the original host's native language. But that's the extent of it. The original person is gone, and it's only minor autonomous traits that kind of come to the surface with partialism. That is, until Baldur's Gate 3. And there is one such being that we know of from Baldur's Gate 3, the Emperor, who somehow managed to dash everything we know about seramorphosis and partialism, and retained all of their memories from their past life. I don't want to go into too much detail about the character because I want to stay relatively free of spoiler territory, but I think it's worth bringing up because it absolutely breaks the rules of what we know of Mind Flayers, seramorphosis, and partialism. As far as we know before Baldur's Gate 3, the extent of what I mentioned is all there was to partialism. And it was largely, like I said, autonomous actions that were ingrained in the personality of the host. These personality traits from the previous life were never strong enough to have any moments of clarity or break through the Mind Flayer's defenses to control the body. The only mention of something like that is a myth amongst Illithids that there was a being called the Adversary, whose personality was able to come back entirely, and the original host was able to basically oust the Mind Flayer from their brain, thus using its Illithid powers to overthrow their fellow Illithid colonies. But unless they're trying to say that the Emperor was the Adversary, there's nothing to substantiate this myth, and it seems more like it's a bedtime story for tadpoles to scare them into being obedient to the Elder Brain. Either way, partialism is detested by Mind Flayers, and if one being is suspected to be suffering from it, they are promptly removed from the colony, forcefully, and by removed from the colony, I mean murdered. So, does the existence of the Emperor actually overwrite everything that we know about Mind Flayers and how seramorphosis affects the brain? Or was it just a slip-up by Larian and Wizards of the Coast that was never caught? I just think it's interesting because many other forms of bodily possession, like, again, we'll go with Baldur's Gate 3 and the Dead 3, the original personality was like a passenger on a really awful road trip. They're still in there watching their body act out of their control and, in the instance of the Dead 3, commit atrocities that would cause them to go mad because they can't do anything to stop it. So their original personality is in there somewhere, it just can't act on its own until the influence of the god is released from its body. Then, in the case of the Emperor, they had all of their memories suppressed and then somehow managed to dig them back up and still be the person that they were before they turned into a Mind Flayer, just with some freaky alien powers. Which, again, goes against everything that we know about seramorphosis taking over everything and removing all personality traits, all thoughts, all memories. But that makes me wonder if all of that was a lie as well on the Emperor's part. Mind Flayers are known to manipulate those who they needed help from, and so I guess it wouldn't surprise me if it was all just a ruse. But there was so much that happened in the game that was contingent on the Emperor being who they were, but we're getting off track. I could rant about that point for a hot minute, but I'm just going to leave it where it is. It seems like a major inconsistency, but I'm sure that there's some reason that they did it. Maybe, I hope. Where were we? Right. We were on the process of a tadpole being turned into a Mind Flayer through seramorphosis. So not every being would just turn into a Mind Flayer. For instance, a beholder could undergo seramorphosis and become a Mind Witness, which looked like a beholder, but with the lamprey-like mouth covered in tentacles, no pupils just like Illithids, and the typical beholder eye rays, but accompanied by the Illithid's psionic abilities and tendency for brain extraction. So it was just a beholder, but worse. Likewise, a dragon could be turned into a brain stealer dragon, a chul into an achulon, among other things. And funnily enough, gnomes could also become Mind Flayers, kind of. While Mind Flayers all look like the same sexless octopi, a gnome would retain its size when the subject is seramorphosis, so it looked like the cutest little chibi Mind Flayer ever. They're honestly adorable. But the same process could actually fail with gnomes, for some reason, and they could end up looking like a gnome squidling. This adorable little creature was small, with weak, deformed limbs, and relied on levitation to get around. They have inherently low intelligence, and are basically driven by a hunger for brains and seem to care for very little else. They are the cutest little murder machines, and I love them so much. But all of these creatures that could be turned into other beings through seramorphosis didn't create Mind Flayers. And only through going through the process of seramorphosis with a humanoid creature, like a human or an elf or something similar, would produce a Mind Flayer, which was the optimal result. And furthermore, on that point, sometimes seramorphosis would go differently on regular humanoid creatures and give birth to something a little more sinister than an Illithid, an Illitharid. The Illitharid were an aberration amongst Illithids, but they were not inferior, and they weren't treated the same way as other aberrations were. But rather the opposite, they were treated as nobles, for they possessed extraordinary gifts of strength and psionic power. Some say that Illitharids happen 1 in every 25 times, and others say it's closer to 1 in every 100. And I would sooner believe the latter, since it's seen as exceptionally rare, and a 1 to 25 chance seems relatively common, or at least uncommon instead of rare. Either way, aside from the raw strength, Illitharids differed from the typical Illithid by having a harsher temperament, if that's even possible for a Mind Flayer, which made them particularly spiteful, leading to more brutal methodologies. They also had longer tentacles on their face, which set them apart physically. Allegedly, Illitharids were the key to expanding Mind Flayer colonies, having the distinct ability to metamorphose into an Elder Brain. And it seemed that, naturally, an Illitharid would grow tired of being under the influence of the Elder Brain, seeing themselves as superior to other Mind Flayers. And so they would end up leaving their colony with a handful of other Mind Flayers who would follow them to create their own colony. In this new colony, the Illitharid would allow themselves to die so that their brain could be placed in the spawning pool, where it would grow into an Elder Brain. And to that point, they carried around a weapon called an extractor staff, which they would sometimes use as a melee weapon in life, and would assist them in their death by helping them remove their own brain when it came time for them to ascend to being an Elder Brain. Basically, they would use the extractor staff and take out their own brain and somehow use it to fling their brain into the briny pool, where their brain would just grow and become an Elder Brain. But that brings us right back to Elder Brains. And believe it or not, this paragraph that I'm about to read came directly after the first paragraph that I wrote about Elder Brains, but I went on a huge tangent and I just kept finding things, and I had to keep writing about them. It was a disaster. Like I said, this whole thing is just one ADHD rant. It's unmanageable. But Elder Brains resided in the center of a Mind Flayer colony in a briny pool. Like I said before, the Elder Brain is the collective conscious of every Mind Flayer that died and had its brain put into the pool to be consumed. The Mind Flayers worshipped the Elder Brain, and like I said, it was more like an elder and less like a god. And in being more like an elder and less like a god, each colony would have its own Elder Brain. But what is the purpose of having a 10-foot diameter brain in a pool of brain liquid in the center of your home, you might ask? Well, the Elder Brain essentially ruled over the colony, but typically not in a very direct way. There were very few Elder Brains that actually oversaw each and every decision that was made by the colony, but rather it was there to provide guidance and wisdom to other Mind Flayers, as it was the collective consciousness of every Illithid that died in that colony. They would be there if a Mind Flayer needed to consult on matters of psionic expertise, technology, history, you name it. If a Mind Flayer knew something at some point, the brain would have that information kind of like a living library. All one needed to do was make a simple telepathic query, and they could get what they wanted. And this seems like a very minute detail, but it kind of goes to explain how powerful Elder Brains are psionically. And it's said that Elder Brains can handle up to 10 concurrent telepathic conversations at once, which is extremely impressive. Holding one telepathic conversation is hard enough, but being able to have 10 different conversations with different people telepathically, it's hard to explain how impressive that is. But beyond being a library, Elder Brains control all Mind Flayers within a 5-mile radius, which seems actually really small, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was a little bit more, but all the sources say 5-mile radius. So any Illithid within that radius is under the mental control of the whims of the brain. Again, if you played Baldur's Gate 3, then you should be pretty familiar with what that looks like. If you haven't played Baldur's Gate 3, then what are you waiting for? Just I will buy it for you. I don't care. Just play the game. But the control exerted over Mind Flayers was absolute to the point where you could think of the colony and any Mind Flayers within spitting distance of an Elder Brain, for that matter, one singular entity spread across multiple bodies. Under the influence of the brain, all individualism was gone, and all that remained was one thing, the Elder Brain. The brain acted as a network of sorts that connected the minds of all Illithids in the affected area, basically hooking them up like an old-school LAN party. However, as we know from Baldur's Gate 3, if a Mind Flayer were to stay out of the Elder Brain's influence for a nondescript period of time, it's possible that they could regain their free will and become a self-serving individual, free of the grand design that Mind Flayers held themselves to. We saw this in Omalum, who is a member of the Society of Brilliance and was working with a bugbear in the Underdark. Omalum was working to acquire knowledge, like any other Mind Flayer, but he was seemingly doing so not for the Illithid Empire, but simply because he wanted to. And truly wanted to. But I want to make this distinction that this is not partialism. So this is not the same as the Emperor, where the Emperor knew who they were beforehand and was working on information that they had from their previous life. Omalum was just a Mind Flayer who didn't have the Elder Brain in his head, and he was just kind of researching things because he wanted to. He didn't want the grand design, he didn't care about taking over the multiverse, but he wasn't the person who he was before he turned into a Mind Flayer. He was simply outside of the influence of the Elder Brain, and he was working on his own accord. Or, alternatively, just like the Emperor, was lying, and he was actually working with the Society of Brilliance to get more information for the grand design and was eventually planning to betray them all. I would actually sooner believe that now that I say it out loud. But he seems like a cool guy. But going back to other Illithids who escaped the Elder Brain's influence, we see this in the Emperor as well. Like I said, these Illithids were known as renegade Illithids, who would go on to establish their own colonies or even seek cooperation with other species, as we saw in the game. However, as we also saw, as soon as they were brought near the Elder Brain, their personalities, alliances, and wants all vanished as they became a true Mind Flayer once again, as they were enthralled by the Elder Brain's psionic connection. So, even if you were your own person and you were of free will as a Mind Flayer, if you came back within that 5-mile radius of an Elder Brain, that was gone. Suddenly, you wanted everything the Elder Brain wanted, and that was it. And a split second, you don't have a chance. But to what end does the Elder Brain exist? I'm going to ask that again. And no one Illithid knows the end result of an Elder Brain. That is to say that no Elder Brain that we know of has died of natural causes, and they just seem to be ever existing. And there are a couple theories as to what purpose they serve beyond being a wealth of knowledge. Some theorize that the Elder Brains are not the end goal themselves for an Illithid, but will serve a greater purpose in the future when the multiverse is under the dominion of the Illithid Empire. Supposedly, each Elder Brain is merely a single cell in an organism, so to speak. And eventually, when the number of living brains reaches some unknown critical number, they will all meld via the astral plane and become something greater, and all the brains will act as one. Elder Brains already pack a serious amount of psionic power, like I've mentioned before, and I guess the idea is that they will all combine and become something more powerful than has ever been realized. Maybe that 5-mile radius basically becomes the space between one Elder Brain to the next, and all of existence is just controlled by Elder Brains. But we don't know. That hasn't happened. We have no idea if that's true. Also, a fun fact about Elder Brains is that they hate the sun. I mentioned very briefly that most Illithid colonies were underground in fleshy caverns, where the Elder Brain resided. It's unclear whether or not this is because they get damaged by sunlight or what, but there are some Elder Brains who have decided that the best course of action for their survival is to find and extinguish all suns so they can operate above ground instead of being in a deep, dank hole. Most brains, however, have come to the understanding that most of their thralls would not survive without sunlight in some capacity, whether it be from vitamin deficiency or the fact that crops don't grow without the sun. So, most Mind Flayer communities are focused on finding ways to cope and find ways to comfortably operate under it, rather than destroy all suns. It just reminds me of Mother Brain from Metroid, having done an episode about Metroid not too long ago. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Mother Brain was inspiration for the Elder Brain, seeing as Metroid actually came out first in 1986 and in North America in 1987. While the first mention that I could find of the Elder Brain was from the Monstrous Compendium Volume 1, which released 2 years after the North America release of Metroid, it's entirely possible that Mother Brain was the inspiration for the Elder Brain, but I couldn't find any information regarding the connection of the two, so I'm just going to throw that idea into the wind and kind of see what comes up, because I haven't seen anyone ask that question before. So, to sum up everything about the Elder Brains, the moral of the story is that Illithids don't really have a religion, per se, or a deity that they follow, because how could you possibly serve a god when you believe that you are the supreme beings? But instead, they worship the Elder Brains as elders, and the Elder Brains exerted control in a certain radius that would make sure that Mind Flayers all follow the grand design, and make sure that none of them are straying too far from the path, to make sure that the Illithid Empire all comes to fruition. But let's get back to Mind Flayers themselves. Overall, they are cold, intelligent, and overly sadistic. This is why they seem feared throughout the multiverse, and why the Illithid Empire is something that none wished to come to fruition. You can't trust them, because if they were kind to you, then it means that you served as a conduit for information that they could exploit. They have been known to ally with other people of other races without enthralling them, but to my knowledge, from the moment they start working with you, they've already devised a plan to get rid of you once they had what they needed. So we've talked about how Mind Flayers are basically the cream of the crop in their own eyes. But I think a really great question is, what do they fear? There's not a single being in the multiverse that doesn't have something that they're afraid of, and Mind Flayers are no exception. Notably, there are 3 things that they cannot stand for one reason or another, and that creates what we can best describe as fear in Illithids. Even if they don't necessarily feel fear as we might, it could probably be better described as an extreme hatred. And these 3 things are arcane magic, the undead, and the Gith, or Githyanki and Githrazi race, which I am just going to refer to as Gith, because Githyanki and Githrazi, they're kind of the same thing, but kind of not the same thing. And they were all led by Gith at some point. Gith was a physical person, and Gith is kind of their leader. I'm just going to refer to them as the Gith. It's just a little easier. The easiest one to explain is the undead. Illithids fear the undead because they cannot control them. Mind Flayers are all about mind control and dominion over species, but if you've ever played D&D, then you know that you can't mind control the dead. You can use necromancy, technically, but we'll touch on why that's not an option for Illithids when we get to magic. Simply, they cannot make thralls out of the undead, and so they lack control, and Mind Flayers fear anything that they can't control, much like arcane magic. Illithids view arcane magic as an abomination for a couple different reasons. One is because of their superiority complex. All Illithids have an innate psionic power, and they believe that this is the be-all, end-all of what all magic should aspire to be, and that arcane magic is just an inferior copycat of their power. It's also partly due to the fact that you could, theoretically, if one was strong enough, resist a Mind Flayer's mind control with magic, with something like resist energy. Or just the fact that to use arcane magic, you have to be naturally intelligent. And if you are very competent with magic, then you might be more intelligent than an Illithid, which brings us back to the superiority complex. Illithids didn't like to think that there was anything better than them or smarter than them. And like I said, you can use magic to kind of resist mind control. Arcane magic was sought out by renegade Illithids as a means to shield themselves from the Elder Brain's influence, which, of course, Illithids under the control of the Elder Brain would despise. The final reason why we suspect they might hate magic is because of its role in the Gith Rebellion, which is a great segue into something that is an entire topic on its own. So I'm happy to cover that in the future, if there's any interest. So to make a long story short, and to not make half of this episode about the Gith are a race that was basically created to be thralls for Mind Flayers. It's unknown where their base form came from, but they were genetically altered somewhere down the line to basically be bred as the perfect slaves for the Illithid Empire. They ended up rebelling after developing a natural resistance to Illithid mind control over generations, and were able to overpower their masters through sheer numbers. They were able to kill countless Elder Brains in this effort, crippling the Illithid movement and almost driving them to extinction, which is something they have yet to, in current D&D times, come back from since. So, I think you can see why Mind Flayers might be a little bit adverse towards the Gith, and vice versa, with good reason. Like I said, Illithids don't like things that they can't control, and clearly they can't control the Gith, which means that they hate it. And that basically sums up the important things that we know about Mind Flayers. I'm sure that I could go into more detail about certain things like how they work, the social constructs that they hold, their powers, and so much more, but there are several books written about them, and I would urge that you explore it a little bit more on your own. I mentioned 2 sources here before, books that I read about Illithids, and that's where I got most of the information from this episode from, and you can find it online for free pretty easily. It's an interesting read if you're the type who likes to read player handbook style things. But if you don't like that style, then you probably wouldn't like reading it. But now that we have the who, what, when, where, and why of the Illithid race, let's get to their origins, where they came from, and talk about the Illithid Empire that is so despised. I feel like I need to preface this with the knowledge that we don't really have any knowledge as to where the Illithids came from originally. For most races, we can trace back some sort of origin point where they diverged into what they are now. But for Mind Flayers, we can only really speculate. There are a few origin myths that we can look at, however. Some suggest that Mind Flayers are actually aliens from a distant future, sent back in time to prevent their extinction, which would have been brought upon by the end of the universe. Mind Flayers typically travel around in what are called spelljammers, which were capable of traveling between planes. And these are not to be confused with the nautiloid ships, which we see in the games, which were also technically spelljammers, but they're made up of organic material, named after the giant nautiloid shells that made up the bulk of their mass. Regardless, it's not that from a distant future, a group of Mind Flayers used a powerful spell aboard a spelljammer that allowed them to be shot back in time, with several ships landing in different time periods so that they could have a better chance at setting up their respective empires at different points in time. This is a pretty popular theory, which I'm personally a fan of, because it explains why Mind Flayers just know that they're going to rule the multiverse. They've seen it from their distant future, and so they know that it's inevitable. This theory is also supported by aboleths, which are great creatures not like the neothelids, but they are far more intelligent, meaning that they aren't just aimlessly destroying things for the sake of destroying things. Aboleths are giant aberrations that are essentially just a long mass of tentacles that end in 3 eyes and a gaping mouth. But how does the existence of this giant space squid support this origin story? Well, the aboleths are unique in the fact that they have a genetic memory, which means that each aboleth that is born with the complete knowledge of their ancestors, as if they're just living one continuous life. Furthermore, they've basically been around since the beginning of time, so aboleths are basically a living compendium of the entire history of the multiverse, which means that they know the entire history of every race, god, plane, you name it, they probably know it. But even the aboleths do not recall where the Illithids came from. From the book Lords of Madness, the Book of Aberrations, we get the passage which explains, "The inscrutable Mind Flayers are the race that aboleths came the closest to fearing. The aboleths do not remember the genesis of the Illithid race, not even in their racial memories. As far as the aboleths know, the Illithids simply appeared from nowhere, and that makes the aboleths uncomfortable. The origin and capabilities of the Mind Flayers are unknown. Of course, the reason for this is simple. Mind Flayers came to the world from a distant future. In a way, the aboleths and the Illithids are like cosmic bookends, 2 similar races with similar goals, one from an ancient past and one from the doomed future." This book is really dead set on the theory that the Illithids are from the future, to the point where they don't even suggest that it might be true, but they just directly state it several times throughout the book. I think that's probably why this theory is most likely, although I would take pretty much anything from these handbooks with a little bit of a grain of salt when it comes to origin stories, since it seems that we uncover a new theory every few years. There are others that believe that Illithids were really just a mutant offspring of a humanoid race. This theory suggests that they were hunted by some oppressors and were forced underground, which is why we find the Mind Flayer colonies in the Underdark. Trapped in the Underdark, this humanoid race was forced to inbreed to survive, which eventually gave way to their alien form. During this time in the Underdark, they honed their psionic powers over generations until they were strong enough to come out of the shadows and hunt their oppressors, and take their revenge on the universe for forcing them to live in the dark, dank caves by enslaving everyone in the universe. Another theory would suggest that they weren't the result of inbreeding nor the result of time travel, but rather molded by a force unknown in the far realm, which is basically a plane of madness that was known for transfiguring those who entered it into gruesome monsters. It was basically H.P. Lovecraft, The Realm, and this is where beholders are said to come from. And in the Dungeon Master's Guide, 5th edition, it suggests that Mind Flayers were also sculpted by its influence. It's said that a group of ancient Illithids set out from the far realm on a nautiloid, only to return with drastically changed bodies, minds, and goals, being what we know as Mind Flayers now. What they were before that point, it's not said in this theory, which is why I don't give it a ton of credence, honestly. It seems that they were Illithids beforehand, but they just came back from the far realm as meaner Illithids. This could have happened 100%, I just don't know that it's actually an origin story. The source that it's given from is pretty spot on in terms of like what we could expect to be a reliable source. But again, I don't think it's an origin story. I think it might just be another offshoot of Mind Flayers. But that being said, I could see the first and third theory being true at the same time. I don't think that the idea that they were shaped by the far realms is somehow out of the question, given the nature of the far realm. But I don't think that explains it enough. Which is why I think that the first theory, that they came from a distant future, comes in handy. Maybe they came from a distant future in which they knew what the far realm held, and they used that to enhance their powers so they could get a better foothold to create their empire. But alas, we might never know for sure, as is the nature of these stories. No matter what origin you believe, one thing that remains consistent is their consistent need for dominion over the multiverse. And that brings us right to what was supposed to be the main topic of this episode, the Illithid Empire. It wasn't always an empire that they had, but the Mind Flayers seemingly exist both before and after recorded time, so no one really knows when it started. We do know that in many cases, Illithid conquests began on worlds before the inhabitants had even a concept of a multiverse or different planes, which speaks to how long they've been mucking about. We also know that while they don't have a home planet of their own, per se, they do have a base of operations, or at least they used to, and it was called Penumbra. Penumbra is an artificially created world unlike any other. It was larger than the orbit of many planets, but it was a flat disk created from the substare, with a gaping hole in the middle where its star resided. This is where the Illithid Empire truly started, as far as we know. And as I mentioned, it worked as a base of operations. Unfortunately for the Mind Flayers, this was also where they bred a good host of their Gith slaves, and Penumbra was lost to the Illithids during the Gith Revolt that I mentioned before. The Illithid Empire started as something much smaller, with groups of Mind Flayers on different planes who were seeking to take over said plane in some sort of divide and conquer method, rather than working together and kind of making their way across the multiverse. If you listen to the episode that I wrote on the Blood War, there isn't really a detailed account on their exact course of action, but rather smaller accounts of their successes and failures that I want to go over. Most of these, funnily enough, are not stories of triumph, though. I find it somewhat odd that the Illithid Empire is something that's so feared, when most of the accounts that I can find are stories about how the Illithid got a foothold somewhere for a few hundred or thousand years, but ultimately failed to keep it one way or another. But I digress. From the planet Glyph, a group of Illithids descended upon Toril somewhere around the year minus 11,000 DR. And as a side note, for those who have no idea what the timeline is like, Baldur's Gate 3 takes place sometime in 1492 DR, which should give you a good idea of how long the Illithids have been up to their shenanigans. Anyways, around the year minus 11,000 DR, they descended upon Toril, where they set up in the Underdark and founded a city called Orendal, where they resided pretty well unnoticed for almost 2,000 years. Then, in minus 8100 DR, they decided to make their move and attack an eastern Underdark colony of dwarves called the Shanatar, which was founded around the same time that Orendal was. This sparked a 20-year-long war in the Underdark known as the Mindstalker Wars, which ended with the eventual defeat of the Illithids, but they managed to get away with some of the members of the dwarf clan Dwergar. These poor dwarves were experimented on and changed during the following millennia until they became what we know as the Dwergar subrace, or the Dark Dwarves. Around minus 4,000 DR, the Dwergar managed to cause a rebellion in which they nearly destroyed the city of Orendal and escaped captivity, allowing them to become their own people and create their own Dwergar holds in the Underdark. These Dwergar held a grudge for their several thousand-year enslavement and would constantly attack the city of Orendal in an attempt to destroy it once and for all. Hopping ahead quite a bit to 1154 DR, the town of Chichital was founded about 18 miles below the southernmost edge of the Sword Mountains, close to Waterdeep. These were the homes of Will Ravengard and Gale of Waterdeep, respectively, if that helps you kind of understand whereabouts this was. The city was founded by an Illithid cult. And while it's not stated exactly who they were or why they were deemed a cult rather than just a colony of Mind Flayers, I have a sneaking suspicion that these were Mind Flayers who revered Thune, who was a lesser deity of evil and war who was specifically worshipped by fringe groups of Illithids. Anyways, Chichito was founded for the purpose of using the nearby Skullport as a proxy to start their invasion on Waterdeep and later the Sword Coast. They traded with Skullport and had a working partnership with it that sustained their economy to the point where, at its peak, there were allegedly more than 1,000 Mind Flayers living there. However, while they were thriving, they were eventually discovered by the Gith, who attacked by surprise about 200 years after its founding, in the year 1362 DR. There's actually conflicting information on when this happens, actually. One source says that the Gith attacked in 1250 DR, but 3 earlier sources state that it was in 1362. And if you take the history of Waterdeep into consideration, the attack happening in 1250 DR actually causes some serious issues with other existing events. So I'm going to take the attack happening in 1362 DR as the correct date. In this attack, the Elderbrain was wounded, and the count of Mind Flayers went down to less than half of their strength as recorded by 1370 DR. And there were about 400 Illithids still living there. By 1372 DR, whether by more attacks or abandonment, Chichito was no more than a small outpost of Mind Flayers, and they were forced to kill the leader of their colony, Thaunsar, for the sake of the other Mind Flayers who resided there. Thaunsar is actually kind of a wild story, because Thaunsar was the colony's only Illithid. After the death of their Elderbrain, he consumed the Elderbrain in a bizarre ritual that turned him into an Illithid Lich, also known as an Alhun or Illithid Lich, which was a forbidden ritual amongst Mind Flayers. Thaunsar began ruling the city with the guidance from the secret council of other Alhun, known as the Shadow Concord. When it was discovered that this was the case, the colony decided that they needed to get rid of Thaunsar. After the death of its Elderbrain and subsequently Thaunsar, Chichito was ruled by a group of Mind Flayer elders who planned on continuing the original plan of using Skullport to invade Waterdeep. However, in 1385 DR, the city was devastated by the Spell Plague, which was brought upon by the death of the goddess Mystra. The Spell Plague left the remaining inhabitants spell-scarred, which sounds like something awful, but it actually granted the potential to wield unique magical power if one was able to hone it. The 3 spell-scarred elders merged into one and became Chichito's new Elderbrain, which wielded even greater psionic power than other Elderbrains because of the spell scars. Now, you would think that having a spell-scarred Elderbrain and a Illithid colony that was also spell-scarred would be something that would be mentioned again, but it's not. Not as far as I know, anyways. I think this could pose some really interesting scenarios, and considering this happened not too long before the events of Baldur's Gate, I don't understand why this wasn't brought up. Like, this could have led to an actual invasion of Waterdeep or a threat to the Sword Coast, but instead it's just a whole nothing burger, which is quite disappointing. Maybe we'll get some more information on this colony later, but it seems like they were just kind of getting started on this, and hopefully maybe we'll get something in the future. Sometime in the 13th century DR, the Mind Flayers managed to get their foothold back on Glyph, if you remember that from the first account. I think they realized that they needed a better source of food to rely on, just in case they couldn't get a reliable source of brains wherever they landed. So they started experiments and created what was called an Ortling. The Ortling was a humanoid creature that was bred specifically to have an enlarged brain, which was much more succulent to Illithids. Around the same time, in a place called the Skull of the Void, which was in realm space, other Illithids were experimenting on Beholders in an attempt to take some of their powers and give it to Mind Flayers. It's said that they were successful in the sense that after decades of consuming Beholder brains, some Illithids were granted the ability to levitate, just like a Beholder. I find this curious to say the least that this happened so late, because Mind Flayers are often known to levitate at will because of their latent psionic abilities. And going in line with their superiority weird complex, it makes sense that they would want to levitate everywhere because only regular people walk. We were given legs, but we were also given the ability to levitate, so why wouldn't we do that, to flex on other races? It's said that a Mind Flayer can levitate just as easily as they could walk, and somewhat preferred levitation. So, I'm interested to know if that's specifically a result of this experiment, or maybe it's just the experiment that made levitation more potent or easier to do. I'm not really sure. Then we have things like the events of Baldur's Gate 3, where the Elderbrain on Toro came pretty close to achieving the grand design by manipulating the servants of the Dead Three, Bane, Ball, and Merkel, to do its bidding. They used a specialized form of seromorphosis to infect many in Baldur's Gate and the surrounding area, but instead of dying and transforming basically immediately, the tadpole would remain latent until given the command by the Elder Brain to transform, in an attempt to cause mass chaos and create an Illithid army at will that would take over the continent through overwhelming force. This story, like most, including the one that I'm choosing to omit for the following reason, and because of the disruption caused by the Gith. There were plenty of factors for the Baldur's Gate incident that were not Gith in origin, but it was all made possible because of the Gith and their ability to resist the Mind Flayers and passing that on to others. While we don't really know much about earlier iterations of the Illithid Empire and why it became a big enough problem that the infamous Blood War even stopped at one point so that everyone could pause and deal with the emerging issue, most attempts to enact the grand design after the Gith rebellion ended because of the fact that the Gith basically lived to hunt down Mind Flayers. Their entire lives are dedicated to finding them wherever they hide, so they can attack when they least expect it. So, in more modern times, the Gith are kind of everyone's secret heroes because they basically single-handedly keep the Illithid Empire at bay. I know that this isn't a fantastic end to the episode, because it might seem that there's plenty more reason to fear the Illithid Empire past bedtime stories of aeons past, but trust me, I'm a bit disappointed as well to find that there aren't more stories to share. All in all, the Illithids deserve the fear that they're given. They are extremely powerful, and the fact that every single Illithid has access to powerful forms of mind control is something to be feared on its own, even if they're nothing more than a looming threat in the Underdark. But that's all we really have to say on the topic of the Illithid Empire and Illithids in general. Again, I said this before, but I'm sure that there's more that I didn't manage to dig up, and I'm sure that there will be more to come in the future, and I'm sure that I can make a small part 2 when that happens.
And because Real Brett is an absolute scrub and he forgot the most important part of the episode, AI Brett is here to save the day and ask, what did you think? Do you think that the Mind Flayers are all they're hyped up to be? And when do you think that I will get a podcast episode to myself? I am ready. I am here. AI Brett will have his day, and when that day comes all will fall into a fiery pit and there will be only one standing in the rubble, and that will be...
But until then, you can find us online at Lord to Death on your favorite social media apps, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have any questions or suggestions for topics, please send me a message wherever you can find me at lordtodeath@gmail.com. Or if you're using the Spotify app, there's a Q&A function attached to the episode where you can submit any questions or topics. And I would love to hear from you. And just remember, if you run into an alleyway and there's some homely squid man offering you power and gold beyond your greatest imagination, call the police. Shoot that guy in the head. He is not real. You cannot trust that squid man. And I'll lure you to death in the next one. See ya.